Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Searching the Sacred. Lisa, Steph, and Jason, and we are excited to be navigating our way through the latter parts of Genesis as we look at the story of Joseph. And so far, we've talked about Joseph and his dreams and his coat, tunic, dress. We've talked about his relationship with his father. We've talked about his brothers. We've talked about him getting sold into captivity with the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, and now we are turning our attention to chapter 39, where Joseph finds himself having been sold into the house of Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard of in Egypt, and so a very high-ranking military official. And Joseph is about to have an interaction with his master's wife, and so Elisa is going to pick it up with the second half of verse 6.
And I'm going to read through 15, and I'm in Robert Alter's translation. And Joseph was comely in features and comely to look at. And it happened after these things.
Okay, wait. I'm sorry. What did you just say? He was what?
Comely.
I mean, is this like a Bronte novel, or what? What are we doing here?
No, Alter's trying to hit at this word a little differently.
I can't wait to unpack that because that is awesome. Okay, sorry to interrupt early. I know that's not how we do this, but that
was 6B. That's all I got.
I know it's great. I just did not see it coming. I don't have Alters in front of me, so all right, my bad, everybody.
Onward with 7. Here we go.
Onward with 7.
And it happened after these things that his master's wife raised her eyes to Joseph and said, "Lie with me." And he refused. And he said to his master's wife, "Look, my master has given no thought with me here to what is in the house, and all that he has placed in my hands. He is not greater in this house than I, and he has held back nothing from me except you, as you are his wife. And how could I do this great evil and give offense to God?" And so she spoke to Joseph day after day, and he would not listen to her, to lie with her, and to be with her. And it happened on one such day that he came into the house to perform his task, and there was no man of the men of the house there in the house. And she seized him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and went out. And so when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called out to the people of the house and said to them, saying, "See, he has brought us a Hebrew man to play with us. He came in to lie with me, and I called out in a loud voice. And so when he heard me raise my voice and call out, he left his garment by me and fled and went out." That is the most awkward reading.
You don't usually say the word comely, and
so many things felt repetitious in weird ways that I don't feel like I've noticed before, like the way that Alter translates. Just interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we already know what stuck out to Jason.
Yeah.
Did anything else stick out after the comely translation?
The comely, such a funny word. I did notice that part of his rationale for not wanting to violate his master's trust was that it would be a sin against God, which I thought was kind of interesting, being that this this is pre-Exodus, right? So this is before the religion is really formalized, and so it's being passed down by the family. There's obviously a very deep relationship with Abraham and God and all that, but yet Joseph is sold out of the family. You would maybe see him abandonment from God, and he's in a land that seemingly God isn't in, right? He's in the land of Egypt, and so I think it's interesting that he's got this. There's something about Joseph and God happening here that I didn't notice the earlier times I've read this. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, especially. Okay.
No, I was just saying, I didn't think about that at all. I was really locked into. I think both the language of speaking to Joseph day after day made me wonder how long everything had been going on. But it also is interesting because I hadn't noticed it before, that the notation that there was no man of the men of the house. Like, to think about Joseph being the only man in the house, and like how that would happen and why that would happen, and in what circumstances. Yeah, that just feels like a notable thing to put in the text that really clues you into either like the trust that's placed in Joseph, or that Joseph inhabits the world a little bit differently where they don't feel that he's any sort of risk.
Yeah.
Which is interesting if we listen to the previous episode about the potential representation we have of Joseph being perhaps trans or somewhere in that range with wearing a princess sort of tunic, how that might affect how he was received in Egypt and how he would be different, either in a less threatening way or in the case of Potiphar's wife in a more appealing way. That there's something about he's different. And what is that? And how do we see him in the narrative? And and his faith in the midst of it is also really interesting. That like he's recognizing that the sin against God piece always reminds me of David in Psalm 51, and that it drives me crazy because he really committed wrong against Uriah and Bathsheba. And the psalm says, "Against you and you only have I sinned, O God." And I'm like, that's not true.
That's not true.
It's really not true. And yet there's something that's worth looking at there, and maybe seeing in Joseph as well. I was thinking about Joseph's name because we didn't talk about that yet. So Joseph is, it means like Yah adds, but it's the future tense. I think the Yah being in there for the name of God I'm not sure that it's actually there for the name of God, or if it's actually just there for the fact that it's future towards this idea of adding. But the idea is Yasaf, which is to add, to increase, which seems to then be a thing that follows Joseph around. When he is a part of something, the household increases. So that's what's happening to Potiphar's house. Joseph is there. He's living out his name. That means these things are being blessed around him. There's something that's adding and increasing around Joseph. But it also has this idea of joining to. And so I'm curious about that with Potiphar's wife. Like, what about him is she wanting to join to? And how is that also his name? And what is it for him to just inhabit this way of being in the world that maybe has some influence? I might use the modern word charisma.
And for those that aren't able to follow along with your Bible in front of you, if you look back at verses 1 through 6 and the first part of 6, one of the things that Steph is alluding to is that Joseph is sold into this family and he becomes like a part of the household servants and slaves, and everything he does prospers. And so he keeps kind of moving up in the ranks and eventually is put in charge of the entire household, to the point where Joseph is able to say, as Lisa read, like, basically, I am no different than the master, other than you. You're the only thing that he has not allowed me to be in charge of here. And so everything he's doing is kind of creating an abundance. Which I didn't know that was what his name meant. So that's cool how it fits with his name.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny I didn't know that because my brother's name is Joseph. I didn't know the origin of that. So so.
Does abundance follow him wherever he goes, or should
no comment? No. Actually, I will say that my brother is one of the kindest and most selfless people I know, and so I don't know if you would say abundance follows with him, but I would say that there's a like, everybody that meets him is just like, oh, he's just such a good guy. Like, he's just such a nice guy, and so like there's kind of like a good vibe. Like, yeah, so it's in a way for sure.
Well, I'm also thinking about, as we were reading this and started talking about it, the episode we did on 10 women, the series on 10 women and 3 traditions, because the woman in this narrative was a part of that conversation. And it's just a really unusual place of power for a woman to be in the biblical narrative. as she's interacting with Joseph. You don't usually see a female aggressor, and a female like person of authority.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that this is the story that has it the most, and it's a negative story, it seems, of how she's using that power.
I also think it's interesting that it's a garment that plays a key role here. So it kind of continues the theme of something he's wearing being the thing that impacts the trajectory of the narrative.
I just keep thinking about like nuancing all of it. I feel like this is the thing where it's hard to play the other sides of things because it gets a little dicey. And when we're talking about like probably like a trigger warning, like there is a certain level of like sexual violence in this story or potential for it. And if I think about Potiphar, like, do I assume that Potiphar is this amazing guy because Joseph has risen up in the ranks? Right? Like there's a way that I kind of think, oh, well, he sees Joseph. We think of Joseph as a good guy. So then that means Potiphar must be a good guy. But if he is the captain of the guard in Egypt, that is probably a very lethal human who has.
I like that phrase, a lethal human.
I can't imagine him being like soft and fuzzy. Like I'm assuming a battle worn position with folks. And so there's a part of me that wonders about like, is Potiphar's wife wanting to get out, wanting something different? Or the contrast in who Joseph is. If Joseph is managing to like increase everything and do things well and do it in a way that's respectful and kind, I could see where that would be something appealing. Definitely went about it in a very aggressive way, but that might be the only thing that she's ever known in her life, or how things have worked for her, or how power has impacted her. And I also can't, but it's the complications, I think, of anything that's related to folks doing things that are not legal, specifically in like that sexual assault and violence world. There's a lot of things that it feels like it's the trajectory of pain and trauma that feels like for a lot of folks it flows through because it happened to them, and then there isn't healing for them, and then they do it to somebody else. And so I kind of wonder about like her backstory of like what she's been exposed to and what she knows, and how this may or may not have felt like something she shouldn't do.
Especially if we think about, I mean, this is true in the modern world also, is that violence and aggressiveness of this nature is about power more than it's about sex. And that there's a real power conversation happening here of she feels like Joseph belongs to her, which is actually true. If he is a slave and she is the master's wife, one would think that she has the ability to do this because he is a slave. So him refusing her in some ways is refusing the authority figure that is actually over him. And so there's real power questions coming up there of how she's using her power, how he's fighting back against the power over him, what the consequences of fighting back against power are, no matter who we are. And even in the, as Lisa was naming this master of the guard that Potiphar is, like his wife would likely be his property too in a patriarchal culture. Potiphar owns everything, including his wife, which is why Joseph doesn't want to do this, because he doesn't. It might not be out of respect for her. It might be out of respect for him. And he seems to kind of indicate it's out of respect for Potiphar, not out of respect for his wife, that he won't do this thing because she's his property too. And
Yeah, he's not trying to insult her.
No.
You don't get the energy that like this is. Yeah, this is more about like and there is a way that like as Jason pointed out, like in the beginning, like there is a certain way that Joseph is rooting it in, like this is like my faith. This goes against the thing that I believe in. What's like there's a core belief that's a problem, but also I'm not willing to risk all the things that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which feels like a solid no. I'll just say. Although it is interesting that she uses 3 words. His response is quite lengthy.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is a certain way that his no would have been a full sentence, but he really does like elaborate to give like the full context of like why this is a no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just keep thinking about like, you know, I think we always paint her as the aggressor and as the one that's wrong. And I'm not saying that what she did was right. I don't think it's that simple. I think it's much more complex in the sense that, like you've said, she is property, and the sexual norms of the ancient Near East are far different than the sexual norms of 2026 in our modern society. And so how she may have been treated by Potiphar, um, could have been very much an abusive relationship, to her identity or to her autonomy. And so asserting some of her own autonomy over those that are societally seen as less than you, not only it would it be empowering, but it would maybe even be seen as appropriate, or expected out of her. And so, I mean, again, I don't know all the expectations or sexual norms of that time, but and we see a lot of different biblical instances of people doing things that we would obviously just go, "What in the world were they thinking?" And yet, that was kind of the way it was. And so, I think it is really, really complex, and I'm trying to find some space to like recognize her, um, with a little bit of gray and a little bit of understanding. Um,
I think in the other series we did where we hit at this narrative, Lisa, the conversation of fertility came up. Am I remembering that correctly? I'm trying to remember if it's in the story, like if it's in the version of this story in the Quran. I think it might be where Potiphar hasn't given her children, and her desire is for children, and that she sees Joseph as somebody who could give her children. And I think that adds a really interesting question if that's going on with her, and as she's being held back from this desire that she has.
Well, it's the complexity of a biblical narrative that because like if we reversed roles, if Joseph genders, I suppose, in gender norms, if we put Joseph as a female, like a womb slave would not be nobody would bat an eye. That shit's normal. That's how it works. And for some women to actually have figured out that this is not their issue, that it is their spouse's issue, why they are not getting pregnant, would not surprise me.
Yeah.
Like I just like there's a particular way that's like, okay, that would make I'm not more comfortable with it. Like I still got to name the thing that it is, but we are completely in gender roles doing different things in this story that the text rarely does. And it does. I mean, and it makes us look at her in a certain way, even though this is happening over and over and over again in the text.
Okay, compare the way that this story has been told to the way that Jacob and his wives have been told as a story. And like Potiphar's wife is just always only the bad guy in this story. And we're naming all of the complicated power dynamics that's not necessarily inappropriate to name all of those things that she's doing wrong. But do we give the same treatment to someone like Jacob, who had 2 womb slaves that he impregnated because he wanted children? And so Bilhah and Zilpah helped give him children. And Rachel and Leah were using those maidservants in order to impregnate them. We have a really similar story here. Joseph is a servant in the household, and oh, this woman wants him and he's saying no. And so we're seeing that the power dynamic is a problem, but have we seen it in the other narratives? Have we also said Abraham shouldn't have done that to Hagar? Have we also said Jacob shouldn't have done that to Bilhah and Zilpah? Or are we only saying Potiphar's wife shouldn't have done that to Joseph? And if we're not seeing those as equally problematic power dynamics, then that's saying something about us and the way that we're reading the text. And we're reading patriarchy as we're doing so for who we see as abusing their power and not.
Yeah, I mean, I think if that's the narrative, then yes, it is really problematic that we let Jacob off and many other men off, and we don't offer the same thing here. I think, and I haven't read the story from I think you mentioned it would maybe being written differently in the Quran, and yet in this, in the narrative that we do have here in the Hebrew scriptures, it seems like it's more about sexual desire or something, because now he was handsome and good looking, right? He was comely, being the rationale. Now we can maybe assume there's other rationale, but it's not in this text, and so I'm yeah. Anyway,
well, and even so, even if we make it that, then we say David and Bathsheba, that I already referenced this morning. That's exactly why he goes after her, is because he thinks she's beautiful. And we say like, oh, David committed this big sin, but then we don't really talk about what he did and how big of a sin it really was to murder someone in order to take advantage of his wife and then have her become his like fifth wife. I don't remember exactly where she was in the order. Like that's a significant thing that David did. It's not just a misstep. And that's also about desire.
Well, and in fairness, like the language of like how Alter is translating comely is also used to describe Joseph's mom. It's like that's how Rachel is described. And we have a lot of conversations around the differences between Rachel and Leah. And like, what does it mean that Joseph is following in his mother's footsteps when it comes to how people view them? Because like we feel okay about it. Mm-hmm. Like Joseph really loved Rachel. So like he would put up with marrying Leah. Right? Like we have these narratives around these stories. And like I don't know that we always think about like generationally what it means then for Joseph to grow up in a home knowing that that's how his mom is viewed and that he's got that similar characteristic. Mm-hmm. And then what that means for people who would see him. Mm-hmm. And like find that attractive. That I don't know, it feels like it shouldn't be surprising that maybe it's surprising that it's Potiphar's wife, but we also don't hear about other women with Joseph. Like mm-hmm. It's just interesting that mm-hmm. where it comes into play.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the language we have there is Yafe Mare. And so there's this little phrase that's then used in a couple spots of Yafe Mare. So Yafe is this idea of being fair, beautiful, handsome, pleasant, goodly, comely, as we are in the altar. It's from this idea of being bright. And so it's the beautiful of brightness. It's Song of Songs. How fair and pleasant are you? Like it's how fair. It's that how fair language. And then mare is the idea of vision. So the mem at the beginning of that. Mare is like you're a vision. You're a sight. You are yafe in appearance because that's from the word ra'ah. So mare comes from ra'ah of to see. And so there's something being seen in the person that is different. There's a fairness, there's a beauty, there's a brightness, there's something going on with mare. The first time mare is used is back in Genesis 2:9, that God made grow from the ground every tree that is pleasant to the sight. So that idea has already been used. Like all of that appeal of the trees of the garden is the idea of Marae that is now being used for Joseph, and was also used for Joseph's mother, Rachel. It's also used about the burning bush. It's a great sight. Like Marae has some weight to it of there's really something being seen in the person. It's going to come back into play back to our friend David. Don't look on the Marae of the person actually, but then he's described as. But then David is described as having Marae, and so yeah, there's sort of some mystical questions there of what is it in Rachel, in the trees of the garden, in Joseph that people are seeing that it creates this desire, that creates this specialness about who they are. Is it about beauty? Is it about more than beauty?
Mm-hmm. Like I think we said like earlier, but like a charisma. Like there's just something like an it quality. You hear that a lot in different contexts. Like someone just has it, and it's like you can't describe what it is. It's just they have it, and like everyone's drawn to it. You hear about that with, whether it's business leaders, actors, sports people, like different walks of life. It's just there's just something about them. Everybody wants to just naturally be drawn to them. If they walk into a party, they're just all of a sudden the main attraction.
That's a great comparison because this is a word used for the burning bush as well. It's like a sight that Moses is drawn to. That same idea of and the trees of the garden, we know they're drawn to the trees. They're drawn, and so what is it to have this thing that people are drawn to about you? And how are you doing at carrying that responsibility if you have that thing, that it factor?
Yeah.
Because there is a power there that you have.
Huge.
If you've got that thing, whatever that thing is. I always feel that way. Like this is going to be the dumbest example, but it just comes to mind and shrinks it a little bit. Do you ever have this experience where you feel like you have said something, but then someone else says the same thing? And you're like, wait, but I said that.
And everyone's like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. And you're like,
and then this other person said it, and everyone was like, this is revolutionary. And like, everybody's following their idea. And you're like, wait a second, though. Like, why didn't that happen when I was the one who said that idea?
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think it's interesting because in different circles or circumstances that quality can be ascribed to a different person. Like sometimes in like smaller like family settings, like growing up, like there were moments where like it felt like I had that with like because I was the loudest one in the room or whatever. And then I get in other settings and it's like, oh, I am not that. And like someone else is, and it's like almost disorienting. It's like, oh, okay, I don't have it. Whatever it is, that one does. And now I'm gotta follow along and laugh at the joke and be, cool, being whatever. So yeah.
I think it's interesting as I just look at the trajectory of this word and I notice that it's used for the trees in the garden. It's used for Joseph. It's also used for Bathsheba. And it's also used for David's daughter, Tamar. And that there's this thread of people trying to take from something that has Marae. There's a desire to possess it or to not wait for something to be given because it's like almost irresistible or something. And there's a sort of a trajectory of sin that is related to this word if the person is feeling like they need to, if the Marae is theirs.
Well, and it can be sin on different levels, right? It's sin that the person that has it can use to abuse others, or it could be a sin that people are trying to abuse the person that has it because they want it from them or they want to possess what they have. And so in two different ways it can manifest itself in really unhealthy patterns and ways.
Is there a modern I mean, we're talking about, like, the it factor in modern, but I'm wondering about, like, as we think about how this story matters for how we see Joseph, but also how this story matters for how we're living our own lives, how we're seeing ourselves, how we're seeing others, like, what kind of things we might start to draw forward from this narrative of Joseph and Potiphar's wife.
I just think we got to be really careful, like who we put on pedestals,
Mm.
um, and why they're put there, or why we try to put ourselves there, um, or what we'll do to stay up there if we're up there. I think all of those are questions that impact the modern world. Um, Obviously, like they didn't have tabloids back then with like you know TMZ following around celebrities and doing all that kind of stuff, but we have a whole industry that basically worships this, makes an idol out of it, makes gods out of it. And whether that's Sports Center or TMZ or the Oscars or whatever we want to point to, but we do this pretty well. I mean, TBN, if we want to just be equal opportunity offenders here, the Christian industry puts people on pedestals and crowns them with the it quality and, the big name preacher that everybody just oohs and ahs over every word they say, even though it's not that original. Um, yeah, I think there's a lot we can be careful about.
I think for all of us, it, well, I think this is a good reflection on, like, I think about the justice system. That's usually where my brain is thinking about it. And the difference, like, if we think about, um, like, it's not saying wealth, but I think in Western culture, wealth is probably one of the things that we find very attractive. And, but like what wealth does, like how that shifts the justice system in lots of ways, like your access to a better attorney, and then a better attorney usually has a little bit more charisma, has a little bit more things that you need, and how, um, and like how race plays a role in how we see people, and we see like guilt or innocence.
Hmm.
Um, like we just have to get really honest about what we've, like how we see things, and then what that means. Um, yeah, I like even wondering, if you just sit and wonder for a second, like why Black men are incarcerated so much more frequently. Like, why are they so much more at risk in a traffic stop? Like, what's
Hmm.
happening? Because it's not a genetic predisposition. Like, right? Like, there's this, we have to get really honest about the things that we're holding. Because I think that's where we get into, like, we start talking about power, we start talking about wealth, we start talking about how we see it, and even in the story, she ends up like casting a story that puts, like, ends up changing the trajectory of Joseph's life again.
Mhm.
And that is not the first woman to do that. Like,
Mhm.
that's actually a history of white women. And then we look at the ways that white women impacted Black men. So like there's trajectories in some of these that actually feels actually very current, um,
Mhm.
that we don't necessarily like look into.
Especially when I love that association you just made when I think about the biblical text, Lisa, because part of why white women have been so problematic in the racial conversations about power is because we've tended to see ourselves as not having power because we're women and haven't seen the power we have because we're white. And that Potiphar's wife is sort of an archetype of that person in the text of like, oh, she's a woman, so she must not have power, but she does in this circumstance. And she's
Hmm.
using the power that she has to harm someone else who has less power than her. And so, how can we, in that sort of in our humanity, we tend to see ourselves as the hero of the story or the victim of the story, but probably white women should look at themselves as Potiphar's wife and say, when have I done this?
Hmm.
When have I tried to grab for something that wasn't mine? when have I used the power that I have in a way that has harmed someone else? Maybe because I was feeling oppressed, I was trying to get, even if we could then give her all of that sort of compassion we're giving her, maybe she wanted a child and she couldn't have a child, but then she's in her desire, she's still hurting someone else. So we can have
Mm-hmm.
compassion for her, but we also need to see the abuses that she's doing and wonder about our own
Mm-hmm.
role in those in a modern world.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like even the text is it plays with that, I think, in the fact that she's not given a name, right? She's Potiphar's wife. And so how often have we felt like, oh, I'm just Potiphar's wife, I'm just whatever. But no, that means you have power if you're that person. I have this, you mentioned the clothing, Jason, and I'm sort of, this feels, I don't know exactly where this is going to lead us, and if it's a tangent, but it somehow feels related because there is this trajectory that's already started about what happens with clothes in Genesis.
Yeah.
And we talked about like this coat that he had, but what is left in her hands after he runs away is his beged, which is his apparel, his robe, his wardrobe, his clothing. But it's his covering. So his covering is left behind. It's actually, interestingly enough, this word for covering is rooted in the idea of deceit as the verb, because you're covering up the truth. So it's the idea of a covering, but the covering that's been used is so far is in when Rebecca is chosen as the wife for Isaac, she's given jewels of gold and silver and a covering. And Rebecca took that, and then Rebecca takes the covering of her oldest son Esau and puts it on Jacob.
Mm.
Um, and that's the whole narrative happening in Genesis 27, and then Reuben, when this happens to Joseph, when Joseph is gone from the pit, he tears his covering. When Tamar in Genesis 38, when she's grieving, she puts on the widow's covering. Um, and now here in Genesis 39, Joseph's covering is left with the widow. Like those are some significant stories of what's been happening with the covering.
Mm.
And so the fact that his covering is being left behind says to me something about like something is being uncovered in Joseph. Like if his covering is left behind, he's now uncovered. There's something vulnerable about him.
Mm.
I don't know. This might feel more mystical than practical, but it seems like something, and it seems potentially related to what we can keep taking from this narrative in a modern world. I just don't know exactly what. Anyone want to take the next step with that?
Yeah, I mean it's related to so many different things. It's hard to like. It's not like it's just related to one thing, and so it's easy to just grab onto what's the symbolism here. So I think it kind of flows a little bit, right? So like the like it being given to Rebecca is really beautiful, right? Because I mean, there's not many healthy relationships in the Bible, but that one kind of seems to be fairly healthy for a while. Yeah,
Mhm.
Isaac and Rebecca until the end. Um, and then that covering is actually used deceitfully, right? And so, but for a long time, that covering was potentially like a really beautiful type of connection.
Well, even
Um,
the deceitfully, though, I wonder about. I
Also,
think
it
we've
was incredibly necessary.
Yeah. I think we've talked about that on the podcast, that it
We
was
have.
like what she's doing with the garment there seems to actually be, it was something that was celebrated for
Mhm.
years of history because she's seeing what's needed for the future. And so I wonder if this idea of the covering, if one of the threads is something that's needed for the future, because that's the Tamar story, putting on her widow's garments,
Yeah.
um, is also then a part of her. Um,
I mean, she uses that to then do what's necessary to continue the
Yeah, the
family
way that
line.
she takes those garments on and off is also a
Hmm.
part of moving towards the future. And
Yeah.
so it seems like maybe there's something here about future for Joseph.
Yeah. I mean, both his tunic, right, and the garment that Reuben shreds or rips in half, or however and then And then this one, I mean, it's both a maybe a blessing, or it's both a beautiful covering, and then it's also, maybe not deceitful, but but also like trajectory launching.
Well, it kind of ends up being like character.
Say more about that. What do you mean?
Well, if I'm thinking, so like what ends up happening is like we'll see a garment come into play in Joseph's story again, and it's Pharaoh giving him garment with his when he gets the rank, like there's a power, like Joseph gets elevated, and then the next time we hear about it is like about holy garments for Aaron being told this. So like you start to see how garments end up having like a characteristic tied to them. And it makes me wonder if like how much Joseph changes in this moment. Not just that like something bad happens to him and it changes his trajectory, but like how does he as Joseph change? And like what happens when he gets after this all happens to him? How does that actually impact him? I wonder about the character. Like there seems to be some character in it as well of like your identity gets tied up sometimes into the garment.
I think that's a really important point. So if we I think this is really important because I think it tracks throughout scripture, because like one of the first instances we see of any form of garment is the fig leaves being made into coverings for Adam and Eve, and then we have God making a covering for them out of animal skin, and then we have these moments that we've talked about with different coverings, and they're tied to identity, right? Like Joseph is special, and what is that specialness? It's tied to a garment, and then he loses that family because the garment is taken from him. I would imagine that in Egypt, the head of the household has a special garment on because typically clothing represents status, and now it's taken from him and he's going to be put in prison. And then we get this narrative throughout scripture of clothing being something that we are to put on as a form of connection to the divine, right? Like put on righteousness, put on Christ as a pair of as new clothing. I mean, like this is what Paul writes all the way in the New Testament. Like centuries later, this narrative is still happening, and it's still about identity. Put on Christ, like putting on new clothes. Like that's all the way back from Genesis chapter 2.
Well, and
3.
and where this is going is as we look at the next uses of it. This very particular word for garment is used here with the garment that Joseph was wearing that is next to Potiphar. The next time garment will come into play is, as Lisa named, when Pharaoh gives him a new garment to wear, indicating the power that he has now in Egypt. But the next
identity.
use isn't until Exodus 28, describing the garments of the priests. And putting on those things that indicate that you are the priest that is going to be connecting people to the divine. So it really...
Which makes perfect sense, because for 400 years, I mean, after Israel gets enslaved, the people of Israel get enslaved in Egypt, they essentially are just wearing, they're just wearing what they have, like the best they can come up with. And it's not until they're in the wilderness, and then Aaron, who's in a unique relationship identity with God, gets a new garment. I mean, it totally tracks, right? Like, of course, that's when the next iteration comes. It's because they're finally free and they are connected to God in a wholly unique way again.
And they get to think about what they wear again.
Yeah.
And how they're using it. Lisa, go ahead.
Plays out a little bit different these days, but we absolutely know that like somebody who is in a military uniform, or somebody that is in law enforcement uniform, or even like religious vestments of sorts.
Yeah.
Like we see uniforms as power in lots of ways. But we also know the difference between somebody who's in a McDonald's uniform and a janitor uniform. There's a way that the clothing is giving us cues to how we respond. And how people respond. People behave differently in a uniform when they're in their uniform. And we learned a lot about that with with the ice surge in Minnesota, just what happens when people are in combat uniforms. And then hearing from military personnel talking about, yeah, there's a particular reason why there's combat wear and then dress, and how you behave differently in each.
When you put on clothing, you're putting on more than clothing. You're putting on an identity. You're putting on the power you hold.
And on the flip side, like you mentioned priestly or clergy garb. I talked to a number of clergy that were like, saying, I got to find my collar, or I got to go get a collar, even though, like, I don't think people in the tradition, I don't know enough about being Methodist. I've only been it for like 5 years, so I don't know everything. But like, I didn't know we had collars, right? Like the little, like that you would assume goes with like the priesthood, right? And yet I knew a number of people that were saying, I'm going to go protest, or I'm going to go observe, and I need to make sure I have my collar so that they know that I'm clergy, because it carries a different level of weight in the eyes of the officers when they're addressing a crowd. Like if they see a clergy member, it says like, hey, be careful here, like, or, I'm here to be peaceful, so don't hurt me. And also, watch out, my prayers might strike you down. So, obviously I wish that was the case, but it's not. But
well, and for the people around the clergy to know their clergy if they're struggling, and to have some way of that desire to have some way of indicating the role that we have when we're walking about in the world. What role do I have? What authority do I have? How can I help you? How can you help me?
Yeah.
This feels like we've sort of ended, I think, with two really good like application questions for people to think about, which is that Murray charisma thing. How do I have it? How am I responding to people around me who have it? Am I seeing myself? How am I responding to that it factor thing? Particularly for any white women in the audience, how we can see ourselves as Potiphar's wife here and really wrestle with what power we have and how we use it. And this idea of garments and authority and what we're wearing to show our authority or our identity. And like, man, that's 3 really good wrestling points from one episode. So way to go, Joseph. Giving us some good things to think about. And so I don't know, we'll see. I think that is a good place to wrap up for today, and we'll see where that leads us next.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical text so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.